This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Theresa May will face further questions from MPs today over the airstrikes in Syria in the House of Commons. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, was granted an emergency debate on the need for Parliament to approve any further military interventions. Before then, there'll be a chance for some of those MPs to warm up for the debate. Here, I'm joined now by the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party, Rehman Chishti, the SNP MP, Joanna Cherry, the Labour MP, Luke Pollard, and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Jo Swinson. Welcome to you all. Luke Pollard, what would Labour like Parliament to do about military interventions?
I think it's the fact that Parliament should have a say before we go to war. There was an opportunity last week to recall Parliament before the Syrian airstrikes took place, and the Prime Minister chose not to take that, which means the case for military action wasn't being able to be put to the Parliament and to public, and we weren't able to question it. And Labour's saying that we should have the opportunity to question the executive, be that Labour or Conservative, about military action in the future before that action is taken.
All military action?
Well, I think there's certain circumstances where if there's an imminent threat, no. But actually, in most circumstances, this is the vast majority of circumstances, all the military action that Britain has taken since 1945 would fit under the ability for us to be able to question that before it was taken. And that is the right thing to do. I think that's what the public expects now.
Jo Swinson, what do Liberal Democrats want?
I mean, clearly there has been now a convention that says Parliament does have a say before this happens, although absolutely accepting the point Theresa May made yesterday, there might be some circumstances
This is a
where it needs to
convention
be
set by
retrospective.
Tony Blair in 2003.
Yes, but it's also been, in 2011, 2013, 2015, and interestingly, 2011 was when there was that imminent threat to life in Benghazi, and the government made the case that we had to act, but then we came with an amendable motion for a vote in Parliament to retrospectively approve. And so I think we all recognise that there will be circumstances where that might be necessary. But even in this current situation, Theresa May didn't come to Parliament with a vote, with a motion that MPs could amend, that they could have their say on. She came and made a statement, and that is another breach in the convention, which I think is problematic, and that's why the debate today is important.
Yeah, Cherry, what do you think?
Yeah, well, from the middle of last week, the Scottish National Party and my colleague Stuart MacDonald were pushing for a recall of Parliament because we don't think that there should have been military action in this situation without a parliamentary debate and a parliamentary vote. I agree with what others have said, that there will be certain circumstances where there's an imminent threat to the security of the United Kingdom where the government can take action without Parliament's approval. But that was not this was not an instance of that. And
why not?
Because we weren't under imminent threat. I mean, there has been a ghastly humanitarian situation in Syria for many years. So we weren't under an imminent threat. There are many humanitarian crises around the world, including in Gaza, where we saw up to 40 innocent civilians shot dead by the Israeli army last week, in the terrible genocide in Myanmar, and also the ongoing situation in Yemen, where it's worth pointing out that parliamentarians have repeatedly asked Theresa May to take steps to discourage Saudi Arabia from the course of action they're intent upon there, and she's refused to do so. So I think there's quite a bit of sanctimony and hypocrisy going on in the chamber yesterday.
But,
the crucial issue here is really an issue of democracy and accountability. There are respectable arguments to be made on both sides as to whether or not action should have been taken last week, but those arguments should have taken place in advance of the action. Parliament should have had a debate, and there should have been a motion which was meaningful and amendable for us to vote upon. We've heard a lot from this government about taking back control and parliamentary sovereignty, but in this situation, Parliament was left out of the equation, and by the time we got to debate it yesterday, it was on a very limited and unamendable motion, and the government didn't even take the opportunity to hold a debate of their own in their own time.
OK, Rehman Chishti, you've got a united opposition here. What do you say? Why shouldn't Parliament be consulted before military action?
Well, Adam, I may have a united opposition here, but that wasn't the case in Parliament yesterday. There was many on the opposition side who supported what the Prime Minister had done. And I think it's absolutely right.
Some of them, even like Ken Clarke on your own side, also said Parliament should be consulted.
But the point I was making, there was members on the other side. Chris Leslie was one of them, and Kevin Jones was another one. There's many members of Parliament on the other side.
I don't think everyone here is necessarily condemning the action.
No, but I'm saying in terms of the procedure that was applied by the Prime Minister, they all supported the Prime Minister taking the action that she had taken. And the point that we are looking at now is with regards to whether the Prime Minister should have come to Parliament or not. That's the point we're looking at. And I think the action taken by the Prime Minister was absolutely the right one. Today is a Conservative government, Adam. Another day it will be another colour government. And the reality is they would have to take the decisions they have to take, taking into account the first duty of the state to protect your citizens. This was in our national interest. We have a barbaric regime in Syria which has used chemical weapons. Chemical weapons, it's using them is a crime against humanity. And on that basis, we had a regime which has used chemical weapons, and therefore take that decisive action with our international partners to degrade their capability, chemical capability was absolutely right and proper to deter them from using that again. And the legality that we had was the same that was applied by the previous Labour government in international humanitarian military action. It was the right thing to do, and I think the Prime Minister was right to take that urgent, decisive, targeted action.
But let's just take that point. You said there are a lot of other injustices, humanitarian injustices, governments not acting on. That's not necessarily an argument against not dealing with one that you can do something about, is it?
The point I seek to make is this. Rehman says there's a legal case for this. It's an extremely thin legal case. This proposition put forward by the UK government in their policy paper, they've not published the actual legal advice, they've published a policy paper that in certain exceptional circumstances...
They call it a summary, I think. Yeah.
I think it's actually called a policy paper, but anyway...
It's a summary, 2013, David Cameron did it, we did it
I
for the
read
first
it in
time.
some detail yesterday as a lawyer, and it's a policy paper.
I'm a lawyer too, and I read it too.
It's not the Attorney General's advice. No government's published the actual legal advice. But the point is this, the legal case is extremely thin. This notion that the UK can take unilateral action in certain circumstances where there's overwhelming humanitarian suffering is a notion that is unvouched by any legal proposition. No reference to the United Nations Charter, no reference to any Security Council resolution, no reference to any other international instrument. It's basically just the say-so of UK government
can I
lawyers.
just say this?
Now, if that's how you want to run things, fine.
The way I
but
want
that's
to run
not
things,
how the international community has decided to run things.
Let me finish. The reason I want to run, is on the basis of having international law. If we apply what Joanna has just said now, is that when you have barbaric acts and you want to go through the United Nations and they are vetoed by one individual, Russia, on that basis, then the world is standing there doing nothing. Inaction favours the perpetrator, and that is wrong.
Well, look, I'm not saying that there can never be a case for military action. Sometimes there absolutely is, and there was some strong arguments the government has made in this circumstance. But it is not true to say that they have exhausted every possible option. The Security Council undoubtedly very frustrating with Russia and their vetoes, and Russia playing a game which is calamitous for civilians in Syria. But there is a procedure through the United Nations called Uniting for Peace, where when the Security Council is paralysed, you can go through the General Assembly. Now, that may or may not have worked, but the government did not even make that case or try that. So, it's not accurate to say, this had to happen, it had to happen last week, and there was no way there could have been parliamentary approval, because there could have been.
OK, I just want to put you, I know Tony Blair's not that popular in the modern Labour Party, but in a sense, aren't you playing his game? Because the precedent around the world, this applies to, in the America with their war powers resolution, it applies to France, is that executives commit force and are held accountable for that by Parliament, and Parliament can ultimately stop it. Now, Tony Blair, as you know, we had the famous vote in Parliament, and it ended up with the war in Iraq, which many people now regard as a disaster. And he was doing that partly because he was shifting or sharing the responsibility. Why shouldn't the executive, which can command a majority in Parliament, why shouldn't it have executive responsibility on these matters?
Well, I think we all act under the shadow of the Iraq war, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important that whoever's in power goes to Parliament to get that permission, to get that support, and importantly, to make the case, not setting out clear objectives, strategy, or the legality of action before it takes place, led a lot of people, genuinely, who might have been supportive of military action, to be concerned about it ahead of it. And I think the Prime Minister spent too much time speaking to her cabinet and not enough time speaking to Parliament and, importantly, the public.
But doesn't the executive, which after all includes the civil service, the Ministry of Defence, the armed forces, the diplomatic apparatus, don't they actually know better about the practicalities of the situation than a load of MPs with domestic political axes to grind?
Well, I don't think any of us are asking for the government to reveal intelligence or anything that would compromise that high-level decision-making. But what we do want is the basics. What's the strategy? What had happened if this had escalated? Because last week we were on the cusp of a hot war with Russia. That didn't happen.
But asking those questions is different from actually saying there should be a preemption on whether that military action takes place?
Well, I think the world has changed. I think people in Britain expect Parliament to have a say in any military action before it's taken, except in those exceptional circumstances that we've spoken about. This was not one of those. If that had happened this week when Parliament was sitting, do you think that Parliament wouldn't have had a vote on it? Because Parliament wasn't sitting last week, that is the big change. And so if Parliament had been sitting, we would have had discussed it, we would have voted on it. That should be the case, whether Parliament's sitting or not.
It's this a priori thing. I mean, why is Britain different from France or America in the way these things are done?
Well, France and America haven't attempted to legally justify their action.
Well, they've done it, though.
No, they've done it, but they haven't
on executive order, that's the point.
To legally justify it. Well, I mean, I'm not a member of the French or the Parliaments of the United States of America. I'm a member of the British Parliament for the time being.
The principle.
And what
Why
I'm
in
interested
principle are we
in
different?
is the democratic accountability of decision-making in the UK Parliament. And I think it's interesting to observe that in the middle of last week, there were quite a few voices in the Tory benches urging caution and speaking out against the idea of taking action. Now, because Theresa May has taken the action, the Tories are uniting behind her, as they do behind their Prime Minister in situations such as this.
As is
so
public opinion, as far as we can tell. I mean, now more people back the action.
Well, I'm not aware of that.
Well, it's a Sky Data poll. It's on the record.
Well, I can tell you from the constituency emails that I have received and the constituents have approached me, not a single constituent has approached me supporting this action. Every constituent who has approached me has expressed concern about the action, wants a proper debate in Parliament and wants to know why this action had to be taken so precipitately without exploring other options and without consulting Parliament. So, I mean, that's just Edinburgh South West. I can only speak for my constituents, but that's the message I'm getting loud and clear.
I mean, Rehman Chishti, why haven't we had a proper debate on this? I mean, I know we've had a statement, but why doesn't the government say, this is our case, and Parliament votes whether they think
Adam,
it's
the
right or
reality
wrong?
is this. The Prime Minister had to take urgent, decisive action last week. And following from that, at the first opportunity, the Prime Minister came to the House yesterday. She was on her feet for 3 hours. And after that, she took part in the debate. So she was in the chamber for 6 hours, answering every question any member of Parliament had to ask. Well, no, look, the reality is, you may not like the answer she gave, but she answered. She answered every question that every member across the House wanted to ask. And I would say, look, in our national interest, we have to act when we think it's right to act according to international law, which has been set by previous governments. And I would just like to say this to Joe. Joe, I looked at the words of Paddy Ashdown in 2013, the man who had a tremendous experience of looking at what happened in Bosnia. And he said he felt ashamed of what happened in 2013, when we let the Assad get away with using chemical weapons. And maybe if we had taken action then, we may not have seen the loss of lives.
That was as a result of
you could equally look at the words of your former leader and former Shadow Foreign Secretary William Hague, who thinks, like the SNP, that there should be a War Powers Act and that Parliament should have a voice in these decisions.
Well, even if you get through the UN, you would never accept it.
Opinion is split in your party.
Okay.
We have supported action in the past.
I just want to ask Mr. Pollard a final question. In the circumstances that Jeremy Corbyn is elected Prime Minister and there is a War Powers Act in place, can you foresee any circumstances in which Jeremy Corbyn would go to Parliament and ask them to go to war?
Yeah, I can. And he's supported military action in the past. It's not popular or politic for people to mention it around the table, but he has. What he would do, in such as the intervention in Syria and in East Timor, what we've got is the ability to have a debate in Parliament. That's not why we are. We need to have a proper debate and a vote on it before any action takes place. That's an opportunity for Jeremy Corbyn or for Theresa May to set out what their objectives of that action are, what the strategy is and what the legality is before British military forces are committed. Because thankfully all our RAF crews came back, but it could have been very different. In that circumstance, we would have been right to ask the questions, why was there a rush to war? Why wasn't the objectives clear? OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Full coverage of that debate in Parliament, of course, here on Sky News this afternoon, starting around 12:30. You're watching All Out Politics. Coming up next, as London's Central Mosque is given Grade 2 status, we'll look at the history of Islamic architecture in Britain.